Welcome to this tutorial on how to create simplified parts using notation software. To benefit from this tutorial, you should already know the learner's needs, what they can and can't do, have established your performance goals, and decided on your notation method. You will experience how I rationalize changes and how I refer to the needs assessment and performance goals to justify those changes. I will be guiding you through this process while showing a real-life example for a new trumpet player for marching band. I will be taking you through the first movement of the marching band show. You can find a checklist with the rest of my compilation of resources for developing simplified parts here. I will be going through every step for the notation task, which is the final task on the checklist. And away we go. Before I even open my notation software, I'm going to pull up the original music. I want to have the score available and then the instrument part I am basing this off of. In this case, it is the trumpet 3 part since it most closely relates to my students' needs and goals. This movement did not require other instrument parts for reference, but I have had another situation that did. It is best to have them available just in case. To start off, I'm going to open the music software and start a new score. I'm using MuseScore since it is accessible to anyone. It is a great music notation software for all ability levels, and it is free. It has gone under significant improvements over the years, and I argue it is better than some paid softwares I have owned in the past. You do not need to buy anything fancy to make professional-looking sheet music. Once the setup wizard opens, I will choose the instrument I am writing for. In the case you need to make multiple simplified parts for the same music piece, you could add all of the instruments into one, or you could separate them into different scores. For example, if you have a flute player and a trumpet player that need simplified parts for the same piece, you could save time on inputting things like key and time signatures by putting them into the same score. I'm only writing a trumpet part today, so that is what I will select. You can always add another instrument later on should you need to. Once I select the trumpet, I click the arrow to tell the setup wizard that I do indeed want to add this instrument to the score. You can ignore the score order as it won't really impact what we are making. You would probably want it in orchestra order anyway, which is the default. After I've added all my instruments to the score, in this case just the trumpet, I'm going to hit done at the bottom right of the wizard. In some music notation software, the wizard may ask you more questions such as the composition title, composer, and so on. It looks like this version of MuseScore just opens up the score after you select your instrumentation. I'm going to go ahead and input the composition title and composer. I suggest inputting exactly as it says on the original part so that the student is looking at music indistinguishable from any other part in the band. It's more immersive and won't stick out when they have their music stands all lined up. However, for the purpose of this tutorial, I am making up my own title and composer just to avoid any copyright infringement on the video itself. Now we are ready to set up the framework of the music. Doing this before note input will save you editing time later, and as we go along, I will point out errors that will occur if you do these steps out of order. In the end, do what works best for you, but I found that this order is the most straightforward and saves me the most time. The score by default has 32 measures. I need it to be at exactly 139 measures. Right-click on any of the measures, move your cursor so that it hovers over the Insert Measures menu, and then click one of the options. Since we have not yet notated anything, it does not matter where we are inserting the measures. Doing some quick math, the 139 minus the 32 I already have is 107, so I need to insert 107 more measures. I'm going to double check now that I have exactly 139 measures. I do. Perfect. We can move on. So by adding those measures, it added a second page of music. I'm going to talk to you about score view for a second. I prefer to have a continuous view when notating so that I do not need to scroll between pages. It gets annoying. At the bottom right, next to the zoom and out buttons, there is a segment that says page view with a down arrow next to it. Select this and you can choose to change the view to continuous vertical or horizontal. I think the continuous vertical will work best for this project, so I will be selecting that. Changing the score view may look different in different notation software, so just be aware if you are not using MuseScore, you may have to go to a different place to change the view. With notation software, you also have the option on whether you want to view the music in concert pitch. This does not matter if you are writing for a C instrument, but right now we are writing for a B-flat instrument and the music I'm referring to is also in B-flat. I'm going to make sure that I am viewing it not in concert pitch. This selection is also at the bottom right of the window to the left of the page view we just discussed. The box is not checked, which is what I want. This makes sure that when I notate a G, my trumpet student will also see it as a G once all of this is said and done and they have the part. This is very important if you're writing for instruments in different keys at the same time. So we have our measure set up and the document is in the correct view. Next we will input time signatures. I'm going to refer to the original trumpet part, starting at the top and reading my way left to right, top to bottom, to make sure I get all of the time signature changes. We begin in 4/4, which is the default for the score, so we do not need to change the beginning time signature. I see that there is a change to 3/4 at measure 75. In my notation software, I will find that measure and click on it to highlight it. If you want to double check you have the right measure selected, the bottom left of the window gives you some good information and it will tell you the measure that is selected. I want to highlight this measure because next I'm going to go to the left side of the screen to what is called the master palette, and I will click on where it says time signatures. It will give me a drop down with essential type signatures. I will click and hold down on the 3/4 time signature and then drag it to the measure I have highlighted. We have the measure already highlighted, so once we have found our time signature, we know exactly where it is going so we don't accidentally assign it to the wrong place. If you do, like anything else, you can just Control Z or you can right click it and delete it. You're going to repeat this process for each time signature change. So I return to my reference part, begin scanning the music from where I left off, and I see that there is another time signature change at measure 107. I find measure 107, highlight it by clicking it, find the 4/4 time signature in the master palette, and drag it to the highlighted measure. I go back to my reference part and see that there are no more time signature changes. Before we move to the next element, we need to check that we still have the right amount of measure numbers. When I do this process in Finale, I usually have the same amount of measures that I started with. However, I find in MuseScore that this process can leave me with a different amount of measures. I have 148 right now, but I need just 139. As long as you inserted the time signature changes as I did, you will remove the extra measures from the end of the score. I'm going to select the measure after 139, which is 140, and then you have two options. You can right click and delete the measures individually, or what is quicker is select the first measure you want deleted, in this case measure 140, and then hold down Shift and click the last measure you want deleted, which in this case is the last measure shown. This will select all of the measures within the range. Now you can right click any of the selected measures and click delete. All selected measures will be deleted. And make sure I have exactly 139 measures, and then I'm ready to move on. So far, we have done a lot of meticulous and seemingly tedious work. Again, this is important for us to do now, so that way it prevents errors as we notate the music. If we didn't line up the time signatures now and waited until after we added notes and rhythms, it would create problems that are confusing and harder to fix later on. Next, we will repeat what we did with the time signatures with the key signatures. This part will not affect the number of measures, which means that we won't have to spend as much time double checking our work. So, refer to the original music, start at the beginning, and input that first key signature. This is also found in the master palette. In MuseScore, it's right above the time signatures. My example starts in G major, or 1 sharp, so I will find that key signature and place it on the first measure. However, when you do this in MuseScore, it will input the concert pitch key signature and translate it into the B flat trumpet part, which means it shows up as 3 sharps, not the 1 sharp that we want. I can transpose it in my head and find that I actually need to put it in the key signature of concert F major, so viewing it as written for the trumpet part will show up as the 1 sharp. I know in Finale it will transpose the key signature for you when placing it on the staff, not in the key of C, so just make sure that the key signature you think you are applying actually transfers over correctly for the instrument you're writing for. Now I scan the original for any key changes, just like as I did for the time signature changes. I don't see any, so I'm done with this step. If you do find a key change while notating that you didn't originally see during this step, that is okay. Just make sure you add it in before you begin notating the measures that follow to save yourself from having to fix accidentals. Now would also be a good time to add in any roadmaps or repeats. My example does not have those, but if it did, I would use the appropriate sections on the master palette to drag those elements onto the appropriate measures. For example, if measure 4 was going to repeat, I would open up repeats and jumps, select the appropriate symbol, and drag it to the measure. There are also some special bar lines, like double bar lines, that some composers use to signify sections or phrases. You can add them in to match the original if you really want to. Unless you incorporate these symbols into your instruction, I don't think they are necessary to input into a simplified part. Next on the checklist is to add in rehearsal marks. This does not affect the actual music you're notating, but it will make the part best match the original and help your student quickly find their measures when you are giving instruction. I'm going to follow the rehearsal marks the composer originally wrote in. You do not need to do this in order from beginning to end, but it makes the most sense to me so that I don't miss any. In MuseScore, there are a few ways you can notate this. In your master palette, click on text and it will have a lot of items. The one I want is the box that says B1 in it. Now, when you drag it onto your target measure, which in my case the first rehearsal mark is measure 4, it is going to say A. So any rehearsal mark you put after would follow the alphabet. However, I want it to be the measure number, not a letter. I'm going to double click the box and it acts like a typical text box, delete A, and input the number 4. Ideally, I want it to be in a circle, not a box, to match the original, but this is not a big concern. I'm sure there is a way to edit the shape, but that is beyond my needs right now. I'm going to leave it as is for now and continue to add in rehearsal marks. You will see that MuseScore is smart. It picked up on me changing the rehearsal mark to follow the measure number, so now when I place a new mark at measure 11, it says 11 instead of a letter. I will continue to do this until all rehearsal marks are placed. Now we can finally begin notating notes and rhythms. How you do this varies between software, but basically you select the note value from the toolbar or a palette, hover over the staff in the designated measure, and click where you want it placed. You will need to switch between note values and rest as you go along, adding them in order. You can go back and edit them later, but it's easiest to input it correctly the first time. This is specifically true for adding accidentals. I'm not going to go into further detail on how to add notes and rhythms in music notation software because it really depends on what software you are using. So I suggest looking at the user's manual, other tutorials, or the software's online guide for notation input. This part of the tutorial is going to discuss what you are inputting based on the original music and the information you gathered from the learner's needs assessment and the goals you established for them. So I'm going to now look at the assessment that I use to understand my student's current skill level and their performance goals. For this student, I want the range to stay mainly within what she is already comfortable playing in while extending her lower range, so she is slowly expanding her range. For her, that will be no lower than A3 and then cap out on C5. So this range is important to know while notating the simplified part because that tells me that any pitches out of this range need to be altered, and I will explain what they should be changed to in a moment. We can't just notate pitches, we also have to notate rhythms. This music has a bit of syncopation, but the note values range from eighth notes to whole notes. I'm looking at the tempo and see that it will be performed at quarter note equals 168 beats per minute, which means those eighth notes are going to be pretty fast for a beginner. I don't want to remove all of the eighth notes, but the beginning part has a lot of successive eighth notes played staccato, which is going to be too challenging for her right now. But looking at the pitches, those are comfortable in her range, so all I need to figure out right now is how to address these eighth notes. There are some options here. We could reduce the level challenge by removing some of the eighth notes. Another option, which I find most appropriate for this situation, is to change the values to quarter notes. So I'm going to make each beat a quarter note value and just include the first notes of each eighth note pairing. So on beat 1, it is an A, so I will put an A quarter note. This means the F natural eighth note gets skipped over. Sorry, F natural. Then beat 2 is going to be a quarter note that the first eighth note of that pairing falls on beat 2, which is G sharp. So the melodic structure is still the same, it is just simplified, so those extra notes on the ands of each beat are taken out. I'm going to repeat this process for the entire phrase because it is just the same pattern repeated over and over again. Compositionally, I also want these notes to be staccato. If she is playing a regular quarter note value while the rest of the trumpets are playing eighth notes, you're going to hear some hangover and it won't sound right. Staccato also matches the original articulation for the eighth notes. You could add this in now if you don't think that you will remember it later. I am going to save this for later because I find it easier to do all of the articulations at one time. The next new music idea is at measure 27. We need to look at the pitches and the rhythms. Out of context, those A's and B's look nice. They're in the student's goal range, but I'm looking ahead and I don't like the E5 and the D5 that follow it. So that suggests to me that those notes should be put an octave down. When I do this, I want to actually lower as much of the entire phrase down an octave to keep the integrity of the melodic idea. This isn't necessarily for copyright reasons, it's just good orchestration practices, and we want our students to be playing from high quality materials. Moving on, I'm just continuing through the music and will explain why or why not I'm making changes to the music. I'm going to stop the octave change at an appropriate time, which is the F natural in measure 30. An octave below that written F is too low for the trumpet. The rest look okay until we get to this whole note on C5. Now, you could argue to leave this as written because it is in her range and is not rhythmically difficult. However, I am thinking about the rehearsal schedule because this is for marching band. This first movement is going to be rehearsed the most at the beginning. I just want to make it a little easier on her because holding out that C for so long at the end of a phrase may not be setting her up for success. I'm going to mark it an octave down to support the student. However, as with any of these octave changes, she can always choose to play it in the original octave should her skills allow her. Because I want to lower the C whole note, this means that the following B and A will be lowered as well because the line is going down to the A. Compositionally, we want the line descending, and this also supports what I said earlier about wanting to lower as much of the phrase as possible as is appropriate for the situation. This is an important example to show that more times than not, there are many decisions you can make to alter and simplify the part. There will not always be one best solution. Just go with your gut as long as it is purposeful for the student's development. It doesn't matter too much what the actual changes you are making. The more you do this, the quicker you can make those decisions based on the feedback you have gotten from previous students with simplified parts. Next, we got a bunch of rests, so we skip to measure 68. I don't like it starting on the B, so I'm going to lower that down an octave, but of course leave the E's. Compositionally, we're in E minor, so it is going from the 5th to the 1st degree, so it does not make a significant difference if it is above or below the 1st degree. Yes, that B is within her goal range, but again, I'm thinking about what I know about trumpet, and starting a phrase on a note that right now is a bit out of her comfort zone is not setting her up for success. If the phrase had like a G and A pickup into that B, I would leave it, but for this case, I'm going to lower it. If this was in the third movement that won't be rehearsed for a few weeks of the marching season, I would also keep it at the original octave. I'm going to follow in similar fashion to the end of the phrase, lowering those B's. We got this one note a few measures later. Again, for the same reason as the last B I lowered, I will lower this one. The student may find that in a few weeks that they can play the higher B, and that's wonderful. That's what we eventually want, but for now, that is not the expectation. We've got a few more measures of trumpet music here. These rhythms look okay, maybe a tad challenging, but I think that with hearing the rest of the section playing it, she won't have any issues. There's syncopation, but it is at a reasonable tempo with the given note values. If this was a student with no musical experience at all in their life, I would simplify the rhythm so that they would only be playing that first B in the measure, then the F and E in the following measure, and leaving out the A and E figure. Another option, if you wanted your student to still play there, would be to look at what other instruments are playing during that part and transposing it into the simplified part. This protects the integrity of the original composition, protecting you from copyright infringement, while giving the student a personalized opportunity to develop their skills. However, for my example, I know that the student has musical experience in choir and is competent in understanding rhythms, which means this should not be exceeding her cognitive load, so I will keep this in. This movement ends on G4, which is perfect for her range, perfect for building up muscles, for holding out notes and practicing even consistent tone. I love it. It will stay just as written. So that is the end of simplifying the part for this example. This is just one example. I'm sure there are scenarios that were not covered, but this is a basic tutorial in understanding the thought process that goes behind making these decisions. You can go out and apply these concepts to whatever pieces you need to write a simplified part for. As long as your decisions reflect the student's current skills and supports them in reaching their performance goals, it should turn out just right. Let's look back at the checklist. We are finished with notating notes and rhythms. The decision-making portion is done. Now we are just inputting symbols, editing, and formatting. Let's consolidate measures where we need to, creating multi-measure rests. This is easy in MuseScore by pressing Ctrl-Shift-M. If we did not already place our rehearsal marks, then these measures here would all consolidate into a grouping of 18 measures, and we would have to unconsolidate them to eventually add in those rehearsal marks and then reconsolidate them. This is a step definitely best performed after note input and rehearsal mark placement. Now that the measures are consolidated, we can switch it back to page view because everything should fit on one page. We no longer need the continuous view. Next on the checklist is to add in articulations. As every other step, we will be starting from the beginning and making our way through the music to make sure we don't miss anything. Earlier, I mentioned that this is a step better saved for after notation, mostly because of the technicalities of inserting these symbols into your music notation software. I know in Finale it is easy to set up hotkeys for fast notation. The fastest way I know in MuseScore is, as you are seeing here, to highlight the section of notes you want to have the same articulation, and then go to the master palette to select the articulation, in this case staccato. Now this only works if you want all of those notes that you have selected to have the same articulation. The composer wants this next section to have accents, so I will do the same. Personally, I would not compose a piece to have this many accents in succession. It takes away from the impact an accent a note should have, but remember that we need to continue to uphold the music integrity of the piece. I wouldn't change this to all slurred, but if I did, that would be messing with the integrity, so we will not do that. Afterwards, there are some marcatos and a couple more accents to add in, and then this step is done. Next item on the list is to add dynamics. There isn't much more to say about this other than starting at the beginning and adding each dynamic that is present in the original composition, including the visual representations of crescendos and decrescendos. Do not worry about the exact placement of the dynamics. This will be taken care of in just a bit. If you were to be meticulous about the placement and alignment now, it would be a waste of time because we still need to edit staff spacing, which will throw it all off. Next, I'm going to add in tempo and expression markings. This could be done earlier in the process. I prefer to do it now because it makes sense to me to categorize it with articulations and dynamics. This is one element that usually only has a few occurrences, so it is no big deal if you add them in earlier or later. Now I want to change the number of measures that are in each row. You could do this before you add articulations and dynamics, but for my preference, I see this as a formatting process that I just want to do after I have all the musical stuff on the page. Definitely start from the beginning of the piece and work your way to the end. If you do it backwards or you do lines out of order, you will have to redo the work you've already done and it's just a time waster. I'm going to model the number of measures in each line based on the original composition. It will be rare, but I'm sure it may still happen, where your simplified part is different enough from the original that certain measures may be illegible if you maintain the same amount of measures in the line as the original. Use your best judgment, play around with the setup so that your student will be able to read the ink on the page. We are almost done. The next two steps can be done in any order, and you will probably need to switch between them while finishing up the simplified part. These steps are editing the elements, so there's no ink on ink, which means that no elements are covering each other, such as the crescendo lines aren't being intercepted by dynamics, the rehearsal marks or measure numbers aren't covered by articulations, and so on. We save this for last because any changes made in the measure spacing impacts the result of where symbols are placed. The other step we're working on is adjusting the spacing between the staves. Again, model this after the original composition, but there is more room for custom changes since it won't have any effect on the integrity of the music ideas. Make sure there is enough room below and above the staff to avoid ink on ink and allow the performer to write in any rehearsal notes or fingerings. Double check there is no ink on ink and then you are ready to review. You can review however you like. Following these steps should ensure that this part does not create any dissonance with the rest of the band and all of the rests and entrances are in the right place. But you may want to put on a recording of the music and follow along with your simplified part to make sure everything is in order. After review, you are ready to print and give the part to the student. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope it answered all of your questions about creating simplified parts using notation software. If there is something I missed, please let me know in the comments below.